Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Chris Rossini, our co-host. Chris, good to have you with us.
It's very good to be with you. Thank you, Dr. Paul.
Okay, we're going to talk about a very important subject and a very pervasive subject, and that is violence. Violence. We are always talking about violence. And when you think about the violence of what's been going on, 2020 was a big year for domestic violence. There are some years, back at the beginning of this century when we had a president that was going to remake the Middle East, and he certainly remade the Middle East, but it was very, very violent, and we are still involved overseas with a lot of violence. But today, I think violence in general, and I'm thinking of it more domestically, and why do people accept it? And I think they have a hard time even defending it or describing it and defining it. But there's lots of ways you can have violence. If somebody tries to rob your house and you defend yourself, that's violent. But the person entering you is initiating the violence, and that's what we're going to talk about. Who initiates the violence? And if it's self-defense, the person defending himself isn't the initiator of the violence. So, when I started on this, Chris, and tried to think, who's doing it? Why are we always complaining about all the authoritarianism and the government? Who's really responsible for this? And of course, there's philosophy behind this, and it's the role of government that's behind this, and it's perpetual, because right now, this last year was really a bad year for us, surviving under violence that's been initiated from all levels of government. When you think of the reaction to the coronavirus and lockdown and all the things going on and talking about forced vaccines and all the issues that go there, there's tremendous amount of violence, and think about the consequence of lockdown, kids not being able to go to school, threatening people with vaccines, and it is really, really a dangerous thing. And people are very annoyed, but I think right now, if you went out and took a poll on this subject, who are the perpetrators of this? And I think Republicans would say the Democrats, and the Democrats would say the Republicans, and they could make a case for it from their point of view. And certainly the noise that we heard about, in the last several years, especially on Russiagate, there's been a lot of violent things done and accusations and people put in jail, people losing their reputations and all. And that was very much from one side, from one political party after the other. But, as I think about it, and have gone over this, Chris, I come down to the conclusion, yes, government is very much involved, and political party and political powers very much involved, but depending on what day it is, you can find a lot of fault with both. So there must be something bigger and more conclusive about why there is so much violence, and it's not so simple to say, well, Pelosi's responsible for it. She's responsible for a lot, but it is not that simple. Oh no, it's Trump. Trump started the whole thing, and that'll start up a pretty good debate. But I think there's something bigger than that. That's sort of the end stages of a country that accepts the use of force, the use of power, intimidation by the government. And the more I looked at this, the more times they're involved. They're involved in everything. And I think that's a motivation for somebody that wants to defend anarcho-capitalism, because they're involved and their special interest and just encourages. So, Chris, I know you've thought a lot about this and who's causing what trouble. So tell us what you think.
Yes, Dr. Paul, and the way we attack this issue is that it's more of a philosophical issue. As infinitely complex as our world is, and as life is, it's very simple on that there are two ways mainly to get what you want. One is the voluntary and peaceful way, and the other way is the violent or threat of violence of politics and war. And politics and war are virtually the same thing. They're two sides of the same coin. In politics, you get what you want with the threat of force against others. Whereas with war, you get what you want by actually using the force. So the choice is always the same for all people at all times. Will you trade and exchange peacefully with others, or will you just take what they have? And the venue for trading and exchanging is the free marketplace, which we advocate, whereas the venue for taking from others is government and politics. And we all have to make this choice. Here on the show, it should be obvious which choice we say or we suggest that you should make. Because if you choose the one that dominates today, politics and war, it not only ruins society, but it also ruins you by making that choice.
You know, some people would immediately react by saying, well, how do you separate the two? What can we do and what can't we do? We have to have government and that sort of argument. But you know, it's not that complex. In a libertarian society, in a free society where personal liberties are protected and you don't deal in groups, you can say you can do whatever you want. As long as you do it in a peaceful manner, and as long as you don't hurt people, as long as you don't steal from people. So it's not all that complex. Anything peaceful you can do. And does that solve all the moral problems and the moral shortcomings of the human race? And there are some, you know, the do-gooders in both parties are saying, well, the people are all messed up. They don't know what to do. They have to be taken care of, and we have to guide them. And sometimes they tell you you can't drink, you can't smoke, you can't gamble, you can't do all these things, although it might be done peacefully, but although it may well not be the best habits of people. But once they lurch over into that and say that, you know, the people have to listen. You know, this whole thing about me being put off Facebook, they said you have to follow community standards. You know, that's an invitation. What are they talking about? Whose standards are they? In a free society, there are standards, but they're set up by, you know, culture and martial and religion, and they're generally well known, but there's a line to draw, and that is the issue of violence. And yet now, after I think of this, and I have my long list here, you know, it boils down that the government's essentially always involved. You know, and yet the government, on occasion, will, you know, suppress the violence. You know, there's some wild criminal out there, and they have to use the local police or something like that. But you know, this whole argument right now is who committed the violence at the Capitol. I think that's an interesting question to ask and try to sort it out. But if you take one side, then you deserve impeachment. You know, that the president argued that it wasn't his fault. And then the other side said, oh no, it was all your fault, and they go on and on. And there are some people like me that would like to see the information. This idea, they say, he's at fault, let's impeach a guy and not even get questions or hearings. That to me doesn't make any sense, because I'm suspicious enough to think that the average Trump supporter wasn't the chief reason why we had violence at the Capitol. And now they're starting to have some arrests. This John Earl Sullivan was arrested. He was known to be a violent person, and he worked with Black Lives Matter. Well, one person can't, you know, do the whole thing. But I tell you what, there's a lot of reasons why investigations were deserving, and no punishment being meted out because it's assumed that so-and-so will, you know, did the incitement. But the whole thing is, you know, they don't use that process. And then the punishment. Right now they're talking about punishing anybody, you know, that associated themselves with Trump. Now, Trump is far from a perfect person, and we didn't support him for the presidency. But to say that we can keep them away and will intimidate, it'll be sort of quietly, and people lose their jobs. That's a type of intimidation, a type of force that becomes, you know, very violent and harder to dissect out. And some of that will never be worked out as long as we have an immoral society, as long as we have a society dependent on force. And this is what the problem is. We depend on the government, you know, to initiate the force and get what the people want. The people aren't allowed to steal, and there's even though there's a lot to do. Most people think they don't allow us in, but they think nothing about the immorality of paying money to their lobbyists and going to Washington and saying, steal more from me. You know, my club needs this amount of money and we need this, and just go on, and we need more submarines even though we don't need more submarines. And they build them, and it is a use of force, but it's not ever seen that way. So I think it's the invisible activity of the government that people haven't even thought about it. Economic policy in this country, and it's not Republican, it's not Democrat. It's the economic policy of forced redistribution. Think of the intimidation and the power of the Federal Reserve. That to me is that is very violent, because you're stealing money, you're committing counterfeit, and you're taxing people through that system. And as far as I'm concerned, so much of it is literal theft that is used to control the people and divvy up the loot. And then you got to thinking, well, yeah, but it's unfair, or this free market stuff you do, it's unfair. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I don't even believe that. The freer the society is, the bigger the middle class is. And this is what's happened now, because we have accepted this notion that government is just an instrument of using force to sort things out economically and politically and socially, that you end up with people at loggerheads, and people are fighting and killing, and there's violence going on. And I think that's where the real problem is that governments have been used for that purpose. So until they understand that the government is participating to serve special interests, it is almost the opposite of what a free society is all about. The free society emphasizes, not groups of people. It emphasizes individual liberty. Do what you want. Don't hurt anybody, and accept the rewards if you earn them. That system was generally pretty well known in our early history, and we did much better. But now we have a very violent system. And if it works subtly like that and is endorsed in universities, in order to keep it together, because the system will go bankrupt, which we are, then you have to use more and more force to try to satisfy all these needs. So, but eventually, it'll have to be sorted out, because when you look at the street violence of this past year, who was responsible for that? Well, it was all Trump's fault. That's why his groups were out there doing it. Then when you look at it, it can't be true. And then you look at it, and there are certain groups there. And then you see people doing it, and then you say, call the police, they're burning up my store, they're breaking my window. Oh, no, that's just a demonstration. They're just expressing themselves. And the mayors come out and the police come out and they literally support it. That's a real problem. The violence is there, which there will always be some violence. But when it's endorsed by and condoned by the police, I think of the same thing. This is what happened in Russiagate. And that finally was sorted out after 3 or 4 years. Russiagate was using the FBI and the Justice Department to use this force and intimidation and violence against people that turned out they were perfectly innocent. So that, in a system that we have today, when you have the legal people and the police department and all supporting one side, the side that's initiating the aggression, we have problems, and that's why people are frightened right now. So I think until they understand it, I always argue, until people understand why free markets are worthwhile and it enhances the person's well-being, that the same thing here, until people realize that the security of the society isn't going to be accomplished by just giving different people the power in the Justice Department and the CIA and the FBI and the local police and the politicians to arbitrarily sort this out. So I think, Chris, what I'm anxious to continue to do, as well as you have been so good at, and that is to emphasize why a freer and a happier and more peaceful society will be done by the rejection of all participation of the government in any violent activity and interfering with those things that are, peaceful.
Right, Dr. Paul, and you made a great point that can't be emphasized enough. And that is one of the iron laws of power, going back as far back as you can. Always do your dirty work by proxy. Let others do your dirty work for you. This has always been done by politicians. American politicians, I could give you some major examples. The federal government cannot counterfeit money. It is not allowed according to the Constitution. So what did they do? You have the Federal Reserve, a so-called private entity, counterfeits the money by proxy. Politicians cannot censor you according to the Bill of Rights. But look what's happening today. Censorship by proxy. Let others do your dirty work for you. Now, citizens are part of this game too. They want free stuff. They're not going to go next door and rob their people, at least other people, at least 99% of people won't. But it's perfectly fine to go have a politician rob someone else for you. You're getting your stuff by proxy, theft by proxy. This is the philosophical problem that we're facing in this country, and it is ripping this country apart because everybody can't rob everybody else. Somebody is, something has to give. And we're seeing the escalation and the anger continue to boil until a new philosophy is adopted.
You know, when it looks like it's going to boil over and the people are getting frustrated with it and they're demanding that the government straighten up, one of the things they frequently do, and this tactic has been used just recently about what went on in the Capitol and some other thing. We have to study it. Let's have a commission. Establish a commission, and the commission can study this because this is so bad. But one conclusion I've come to over the years has been that government commissions to study and iron out these problems are usually there to cover up things. You know, whether I think the 9/11 stuff is used to cover up. I think especially the Warren Commission was used. Just think of the policing activity of the CIA and others that was involved in the Kennedy assassination. Then they have a commission. Nothing more than cover up. But the people demand it and accept it. But the government, oh, okay, we'll have a commission. And even right now, they're talking about it. We want to find a commission on who caused the riots in the summer and who were the real instruments of initiating all that activity at the Capitol. So, and the other thing that the government and the people would demand, it's a mess, it's corrupt. And what we need are whistleblowers. We need people to come out and tell us the truth. You've been on the inside and you learn the truth, and you have to let us know. Which sounds pretty good to me. But what happens? The whistleblower becomes the criminal. They can end up going to prison or being kicked out of the country. Just think of Edward Snowden. You know, he told us what was really going on. He tells us the truth at his own risk. And so, of course, he loses his freedom. And, Assange the same way, although he wasn't even an American citizen because he was supposed to have broken one of our laws. The whistleblower is not the answer. Of course, the ultimate answer is having a moral society, and morality with the people that, don't do what you can get away with even in a free society. But it's a shame that even when the people get frustrated, they end up getting the government to compound it. Well, let's have some reforms. Let's have some reforms on the social media. Well, the social media, that's been established, and that's an arm of the government to spy on it. So even when they do that, if you have reform, I don't have high expectation. They've had reforms, I was so opposed to the Patriot Act after 9/11, and that 9/11 was just an excuse to pass legislation they had sitting on the table there, and they bring it out. But they've had times that they have to re-vote for it and have a chance to change it or let parts of it disappear. and it usually gets worse. They don't get rid of it, and it gets worse. So that's why the purity of an understanding of what liberty is very, very important, and then a clear understanding of what the role of government ought to be. And you say, oh, that is so idealistic. That is never going to happen. And I'd say, probably right. But if you don't have a vision of that, of what it would be like when people are moral and they do not initiate force and violence and they don't permit the government to do it, I'll tell you what, we're on the right track. So that would also involve foreign policy. You mean you want to go back and read the Constitution? I was told when I was going to war in the Middle East that, that business about declaring war, that's an anachronism. We don't follow that anymore. And I was just told that, in the Congress. So they will, do what they want to do, and it's up to the people to stand up for it and understand why it's necessary to understand these principles. So if the Constitution says that you're supposed to declare war and you're not supposed to counterfeit money, why do we let them do it? Oh, well, we're going to get at something, and Chris, you addressed that subject. We want to get something. We know that if deficits are run up, we're going to help the poor and give them a house and give them food stamps. Yet what has it led to? 0.1% of our population having 80-90% of the wealth? It's the worst thing in the world as compared to what would happen in a free market economy. So, but it has to be narrowed down to this point of describing what freedom is, what the role of government ought to be. Has the Constitution been helpful? If we obeyed it, maybe it could be helpful to us once again. But right now, there's a pot boiling out there, and I hope that people will listen because their instincts are right. I think most people who are complaining out there, even though they may call themselves Democrats and on the left, I don't see they would totally reject this whole notion of personal liberties. And what about a more peaceful approach to world affairs? I just believe that there's a natural instinct. It's this conditioning, and this is probably the source of so much of this violence, and it comes from our university, government-run university that preaches this. So they feel good about it. So if that's all the people hear from being a small child in movies and everything directing these conditions, and then the government accepts it, so the people think this is normal, and that you're some type of radical person that deserves severe punishment if you take a position of keeping the government out of our lives and trusting people to use their liberty in a positive way.
Very good, Dr. Paul. I'm going to close by saying that liberty will not be brought through politics or force. And that may seem strange from a show called the Ron Paul Liberty Report, considering Dr. Paul was in Congress for decades. But if you think that he was there to change Washington, then you missed it. Dr. Paul was there for education. He changed millions of minds. He used the political platform for education. He did not change Washington, but he did it when it comes to educating millions of people all over the world. Because when you go to Washington to change Washington, you're going to lose. You're on their turf, you're going to play by their rules, and nobody, not even a president like Trump, is going to change Washington. They are trying to drive that home to 300 million people. Don't even think about changing what goes on here. So you have to change and advocate for liberty on your own turf, using your own terms, by choosing to live the principles of liberty that you learn, live voluntarily with others, don't look to rob others using politicians, don't look to get special favors from the government for your business or whatever, and others will notice you and they will imitate you, and they will choose to live the same way because it's a superior way to live. Now, you may think to yourself, that'll take too long. It seems that way, but it's just not true. All we have to do is look back to our founders. Washington said that liberty, when it begins to take root, is a plant of rapid growth. And that's because it taps into our humanity, what we really are. We all know that we're free deep down. So there's no faster way to liberty and a libertarian society than personally changing yourself first.
Very, very good, Chris. And I want to narrow it down to where I think the greatest threat comes on the perpetrator of violence, and I think it's the government. Because the evidence is so strong. If you look at the international wars, the kids that have to fight and die and lose their limbs, they don't get together and say, oh, let's go have a war. That sounds exciting. That's not the way wars happen. It's always government, and it's always another generation. And the young people are the victims, both physically and financially, and the country suffers from that. So the government is the problem, and I think they're the worst. But it's not so simple as that, because people think the government, that's the Congress, that's those Democrats and Republicans fighting up there, and we just need to get in there and clean house. Now, I'm thinking of it more complicated than that, because I'm thinking about it that government has been influenced by the educational system. The government runs schools, teaches the economics and the history and the politics of it. So government is a reflection of that. So if you just look at the government and say, yeah, you're right, they perpetuate so much violence. They have run the Fed and the IRS, and they write all the regulations, and they do the lockups and all this thing. It just makes it worse. But there's another source of control over the government. There's the people who gravitate there. Hayek says the worst always gravitate to the top, and the worse your philosophy is, sometimes the more you get promoted. And all you have to do is look at the Congress right now, and you can say, well, that sounds pretty true. So you have these other areas that have influence on the government, but there's one more, which is a big one. And that is, who really controls it once it's been established? Yes, we know that welfareism promotes government, regulations promote government, wars promote government. It's on and on. But then you have to deal with who's pulling the strings, who's in charge. And I think there is a real thing called the deep state, the shadow government. See, people who are very, very powerful. Oh, that's too much, fear-mongering, and that's not true. Well, it isn't. I don't think of it as 5 people that get together and they make all the plans. I think philosophically they do come together, and just think how they speak in uniform if you look at the media. But there is very, very great power. The government responds to lobbyists. The government responds to money. They're the ones who buy the politicians. They get them into office, and then they take care of them. So it is the deep state, the people behind, and they've been rewarded well. They're the trillionaires and the billionaires. And who pays the price? The people who have been told, I'm going to take care of you. The people who vote and claim they're going to do the most for the middle class and the poor, they keep getting elected, believing that, they're going to take care of us. Someday they're going to wake up and say, they robbed us. And the deep state benefited by that. So you have the government, and you have all these extra areas like the educational system and everybody that participates in that. But ultimately, it's this power group, and they have a lot of power, and they don't have to march out with guns. They don't have guns. But right now, political correctness, which has been, so much out of control, that if you don't participate, they're going to destroy you. And you say, well, they can do that. They're not pointing a gun and they're not using force. Yes, it's a type of intimidation using economic power and social power that they can literally change the world, and that's all part of the deep state. The only answer to that is philosophic, getting more people to accept the ideas of what a moral, free society is all about and have the influence. More people should be dependent on a true education outside of the educational system, which is run by the government. And unfortunately, the bigger the name in the university, the more expensive it is, the more eager the people are to go there. And I think the founders had a good idea. They were a well-educated group of individuals that existed in our history. And what did they have? They had books that they had to go find and read. And here, our educational system is different. There are alternatives. There's tutors. There's private schools, there's home schools, and there are public government schools that if you sort it out, it doesn't mean you have to go to an Ivy League school and think that, boy, if I graduate from there, I'm going to be I'll be set for life, I will become an attorney, and I'll have a name there, and he'll participate in all this. So, and this will be necessary as if things break down. People will have to have alternatives. Right now, we're getting a lot more inquiries to our homeschooling program than we've ever had before, because people are sick and tired of this sense of use of violence to force people into lockups and treating our children the way they are treated. So I see the mess we're in as an opportunity to present the cause of liberty and the philosophy of liberty and emphasize what shall the role of government be. And that role is very simple. Their job is to do their best to help protect the cause of liberty. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.